Having to deal with life is depressing, and this depressed look could not be hidden from this day-to-day nursing assistant, Ruth. The movie opens up with Ruth taking care of an old sick patient who gave her 2 cents on black people before kicking the bucket. Ruth, who had totally been stressed for the whole day, decides to go to a local bar and relax herself a little while reading a book. There she meets a man who chipped into the book she was reading. She becomes more interested in the conversation when he reveals the spoilers to the book that got her hooked. Later that day, when she got back home, she finds out that her house has been burgled. Trying to figure out what actually happened, she noticed some unusual movements 2 rooms away from her. She quietly picks up a kitchen knife as she attempts to scare of the burglar, but unfortunately there was no one there. Later on, she calls the police, who inspected the house and finds out that her laptop, some medications and a silverware belonging to her grandmother had been stolen. They began asking her questions in regards to the burglary, but then noticed that she was too clumsy and carefree and she don't actually have a single clue on what's going on in her house. The police gives her an advice on paying close attention to her home security with no promises of catching the burglar. That night Ruth goes to visit her friend. She wasn't particularly hurt because of what the burglars stole from her, she was hurt because of the way they violated her home. She talked to her friend about her day and how she had lost a patient today. While talking about how disgusting humans are, she burst out of control. Luckily her friend comforts her, reminding her that everyone ain't built the same way. The next day she goes back to her house just to see a dog shit on her front yard. Ruth becomes furious because this has been happening for quite some time despite her very obvious sign of no shitting. She looks ahead and sees a man walking his dog. She angrily packs up the dog shit and throws it towards him, confronting him for his acts. The man is surprised and immediately apologizes for the inconvenience, saying he didn't see the sign. As Ruth goes back inside, she becomes security conscious as she began cleaning and changing old locks. She also took it upon herself to identify any loopholes and opening that could have aided the burglars. Luckily for Ruth, she finds a footprint dug deep into the mud. She quickly rushes to the store to get plaster and then carve it out using scrambled eggs. She goes on asking her neighbors if they knew anything about the robbery, but none of them gave out any useful information. She meets up with the last neighbor, who unexpectedly was the man whose dog shit in her yard. He apologizes once more and promises to balance the energy between them. Ruth spills out the reason why she actually came to see him. She tells him about the robbery and how the authorities had declined to help her. The man becomes furious, which freaks out Ruth. She quickly takes her leave as she doesn't want to sign up for what she can't handle. Just as she had given up on the search, she decides to try the location app once more to track her laptop. Just then her phone beeps. It traces the location of the laptop to Grove Street. Nervous about the whole situation, she hurriedly calls the police, but they refuse to dispatch units to the location, saying she needs to add the information to her report book. Frustrated, Ruth heads out to scout the location where the laptop was traced to. After observing the area for quite some time, she decides to step out, but then retreats when she heard a loud bang. She desperately needs someone to accompany her as a backup to the place. She decides to visit her weird neighbor Tony and explains how she had tracked down her laptop. Tony regards himself as a ninja and tells her he was fully prepared for the situation. When they got to the location, he becomes nervous and begins praying. Ruth becomes terrified as she might be the one saving her savior. They walk towards the house where the alleged burglar could be living. When they got to the door, they see a mean-looking man smoking. Ruth explains to him the whole issue, saying she doesn't want any trouble. But he laughs it off as he wasn't interested in what she was saying. Just then Tony mistakenly lets out his weapon, which hits the man on his nose, causing him to bleed, running off into the house. They go after him. With other occupants of the house terrified, Tony seizes the opportunity and steps up confidently. Ruth tracks her laptop, and in their presence it was confirmed that it was actually hers. She picks up her laptop, and then asks them for the silverware they took. The man being accused of theft is surprised and then tells her that he actually bought the laptop from a consignment shop named Killer Sills, and he didn't steal it from anyone. Tony and Ruth then leaves the house with their laptop. They go back home to party hard as their mission had been accomplished. The next scene switches to a burglar who had come into a party uninvited. He steals some jewelry but was soon noticed because of his suspicious movements. As he was about going out of the house, he was confronted by a house member who threatened to call the police. Afraid of being caught, he beats up the man and then flees the scene. He becomes more mysterious as he goes into the forest to meet up with his other gang members, who he hands over the stolen jewelry. The next morning Tony and Ruth could be seen having breakfast, but they weren't at peace cause Ruth needed to locate the salvage consignment to retrieve her grandmother's silverware. When they got to the consignment, they meet up with an old man in the counter. He welcomes them properly and insists on playing them good music, but they decline. Ruth asks about his silverwares and if any new shipment came in recently. As he proceeds to show her his collections, the doorbell rang and some other customer walks in. He leaves them to comb the shop for what they need as he goes over to attend to his customer. While going through the shelves, she finds the box of her grandma's silverware. Just then she had flashback memories of their time together. She signals Tony and tells him to go start up the car for their escape. Meanwhile, the burglar and his gang had visited the consignment shop today and even parked their van beside Ruth's car. Just as Ruth was about leaving with the jewelry, she noticed the shoe of the burglar was exactly the same prints with the one on her yard. She goes after him while the old man confronts her for stealing his antiques. Just as the old man grabbed her arms, she swings the jewelry box so hard and then hits the man. He becomes furious and breaks her fingers, but luckily Tony was just in time to knock him out. Ruth and Tony visits the hospital to get her broken fingers fixed. She is given a drug and warned not to take alcohol or drive for the time being. While driving back home, Tony confesses how he doesn't have much friends and being with her makes him electric. Noticing her suicidal mood, he offers to take her to an afternoon service where her spirit will be lifted a little. She visits the church and share her moments with Tony by her side. Meanwhile, the burglar and his gang pay a visit to a gun dealer. While trying to intimidate his crew, the gun dealer makes a stinking joke about the burglar and his gang. In retaliation, the ringleader drops a comeback. Brushing it all aside, they decide to deal with the business at hand. The scene then switches to Ruth sucking up on the fact that they weren't able to get the burglar. Tony comes to the rescue. He tells her that he was able to get the tag number and they could trace the license plate. He goes over to the web as he tracks down the license plate number to a man named Christian Rumax. The next day, Ruth goes over to the police station with the footprint she had carved up in the license registration. She tries to convince the police officer that whoever owns the license number was the person that burglarized her house. The police officer becomes upset at her ridiculous claim, saying she was trying to teach him his job and she shouldn't go around confronting suspects without an official permission. He lets her know that the world is bigger than her silverware problems and people are actually experiencing real-life issues, just like how he is about to lose his wife through divorce, but Ruth keeps bugging him with her little problems. At that moment, Ruth decides to take matter into her own hands. She goes over to purchase a fake badge. Accompanied with Tony, they decide to pay Christian Rumax a visit. Arriving at the place, she sees that it's a very big mansion and then decides to impersonate as a cop. She meets his wife as he wasn't around. She hosts them well and proceeds to make nut milk for them while they wait for her husband. During their shared conversation, Ruth discovers that Christian is a lawyer and he gave the van off as a gift to his son Chris Jr. Chris had started doing drugs which made Christian disown him, even to the extent of cutting off his credit card. Just as they were discussing, Christian walks in with his bodyguard. He discovers that they are fake cops and asks his bodyguard to apprehend them. Ruth gives him a breakdown of everything and how they disguised as fake cops to confront the burglar for what he did. Christian is amused by her statement. He tells her that she can't correct the world and anyone can do anything they like. He tries to pay her off, but she refuses, saying she just wants humans to stop being assholes. Furious on how things turned out, she began destroying his lawn arts, and even took one of his tiger arts with her. Meanwhile, Chris and his gang are paranoid because they feel Ruth and Tony are after them. They decide to tail her. Tony, on the other hand, isn't pleased with what Ruth had done. She taking the lawn tiger wasn't part of their mission and he certainly didn't want to associate himself with her anymore as she was going out of control. The gang catches up with Ruth as Chris goes after her. He tries to confront her, but she uses the carved up footprint to hit him hard on the throat, which made him gasp for air. He strolls onto the street and gets hit by a bus. Just as Ruth is about calling the authorities, the remaining gang members abduct her after hitting her so hard on the head. She gains consciousness to see them all dressed like they were going for a robbery. Meanwhile, Tony notices that Ruth had gone missing as the police investigates the scene where Chris was hit. The scene switches to Ruth and her abductors. They offer her a gun, demanding that she helps them with their mission. They tell her to give them access to Christian Rumax's mansion, else she loses her life. With no other option, she does exactly as she was told and they gained access to the mansion. The robbers demand for Christian. Just as his wife called out his name, he suspects that something was wrong. Christian quickly goes to grab a pistol as he plans on defending his home from this robbers. Unfortunately, he wasn't that sleek as one of the robbers shot his hand. With all the commotion going on, Ruth began to throw up as she released her gun. The bodyguard quickly rushed to pick it up, but then he discovers that it isn't loaded. The gang leader, identified as Marshall, then engage in a struggle with the bodyguard, shooting him directly to his throat. Marshall kills the bodyguard and then demands for the money. Chris had given them information on where the safe was, so Marshall dragged Christian to the fireplace, asking for the passcode. Christian unlocks the safe, but there was nothing in it. It then dawned on them that the money was no longer in the house. Furious about how things turned up, Marshall's daughter, who is the second robber, then decides to kill them all. But Tony turns up as a savior once more. He throws a spike at her face. She becomes furious and then tries to shoot at Tony, but instead she blows up her hand. Just as things were getting heated up, Christian goes for Marshall's gun, but instead he was shot right in the head, retaliating to what Tony had done. Marshall's daughter stabs him severely before a bullet mistakenly hits her head during a gun tussle between Ruth and her father. Ruth picks up Tony and they flee the scene before any more harm could get to them, witnessing his beloved daughter death. Marshall becomes ruthless and goes after Ruth. Trying to flee away from Marshall, she heads out into the thick forest, but this doesn't stop Marshall as he follows suit. Ruth, with the responsibility of taking care of an injured Tony, then decides to hide him in a safe spot and face Marshall, who is after her life. While trying to save herself, she throws rocks at him, which makes him fall into a pond. This time there's no escape as a deadly snake feasts upon him. Ruth runs back to Tony and then finds out that he's dead. She was in tears as they had only started to form a close bond. After the ugly turnout of events, Ruth goes to the police station to prove that she was right all along. She had returned back to her lonely and depressed life while seeing visions of her close friend Tony.